Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Bentley, who I've known for some time. A lot of people forget that music is a mixture of sound and silence. And I think we have to be reminded from time to time that those two are mixed together in music in very powerful ways. And working alongside Richard, I was forced to consider that mixture of sound and silence, and also to consider the music of everyday sounds rather than just the music of constructed sounds that human beings make. And that interest has grown, and being alongside Richard has been a wonderful journey, because he's made me aware of things of the art that I practice, of music that perhaps I was less aware of if I hadn't met him. So I'm not going to take any more of Dr. Bentley's time. I'm going to hand over to him and to deal with contemplative listening and the sacredness, the spirituality of his approach to music, sound, silence, call it what you will. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Jean. And well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I've learned so much from Jean as well, from her books and from the chats that we've had over the years. So thank you very much. So it's lovely to be with you here this evening. I've got a presentation which hopefully will take at least an hour, but I've got a funny feeling it might be slightly longer. So if you need to go at any point after, that's fine. Can everyone hear me okay, first of all? Is that, yeah?
Yeah,
lovely.
fine.
Super. And if you've got headphones or good speakers and can use those, I might suggest that you do that for this presentation, because we've got some various sounds being played and a couple of videos as well. So the sound element of this might be quite important. So if it's not too complicated, then do don the headphones. I'm going to try, and I've got a presentation. It's there's lots of slides. I tend to use them because my kind of thinking is not very linear generally. So left to my own devices, I'd go off on all sorts of tangents. So I'm kind of using it to tether me and hopefully convey something meaningful over the next hour or so. If there are any silences, they're of course intentional. If you do find that my lips are moving and you can't hear anything, they're maybe not intentional, but I'm certainly hoping that that's not the case and you can stay with me. I think we might have some time for questions at the end. Would you prefer to do that, Annalisa, or a sort of break in between at the end?
It's probably better to do it at the end, because some people have to leave early. So,
Lovely.
Yeah.
Super. I will have time for questions at the end. So if you want to jot things down on the way, that's lovely. I'm hoping, although I've got a background in sound, I was music production teacher, music technology teacher for many years. I'm hoping that a lot of what I'm talking about will have interest to all sorts of areas: spirituality, contemplative practice, and for people who work in other disciplines. So I tend to work also with sculptors and painters and mural artists and performance artists and all sorts. So, and I've really learnt loads from them. So I'm hoping that that kind of exchange can happen today. And particularly photography today, I think I've learned the contemplative photography arena is quite large. Actually, there's quite a lot of work going on in that area, and I've borrowed quite extensively some of the some of the ideas and thinking there as well, and try to translate it in some ways and use it as a inspiration for my own work in contemplative listening and field recording. So without further ado, I'm going to, first of all, I'd just quite like to ask you, if you have got access to the chat at the bottom, just to ask you what you think of when I say the word contemplative. So if you could pop that in the chat, it would be really interesting, I think, just to see what people think of. So we've got reflection, mindful, yeah, quiet reflection, thoughtful meditation in peace, focused, thoughtful observation, allowing the mind to wander, So I think there's anyone else? Just wait a second. Ever deepening silence. That's a lovely one. There's some lovely thoughts there. I think it's one of those terms, or losing yourself in beauty as well. It's one of those terms that can have can sort of evoke many kind of images. I think it can be that kind of thoughtful, pensive, reflective state of mind. It can mean, you said there's sort of allusions to being relaxed, or maybe focused. There's some people would say with contemplative, it may evoke a sense of monastic. That could be a Christian monastic life, or it could be, Buddhist prayer and meditation, perhaps, a quiet holiness. But I think that you've kind of summed up quite a lot of that in the comments. So it's really lovely to have that kind of starting us off as to what we think contemplative might be. What I'm going to do in the first part of the presentation is to explore that. So I'll hand over now to my PowerPoint, and hopefully you'll be able to see me in the corner there. Let's share screen. So hopefully everything, you'll see me still up in the corner. Super. So what I'd like to do then is to explore what contemplative listening means to us. So looking at the words contemplative, just outlining what I mean by listening. And also I'm going to add field recording in as well, because a part of my practice is kind of extending listening using field recording and different microphones and transducers and the like, to try and access sounds that we might not hear otherwise. So that's the first part of the presentation. Then I'm going to move on to look at working from practice to a better understanding of contemplative listening. I think one of the problems with diving in with a definition is that it becomes quite abstract. So what I'm going to try and do is outline some of the contemplative listening exercises that I deliver and I practice. And then hopefully in the last section, try and draw some of that practice together and identify some of the key features of contemplative listening, some of the things that I think might transfer from other contemplative practices as well. So that's really kind of the outline. There's sort of 3 sections to this talk. So let's start with contemplative, because I think as well, we have our own traditions, our own cultures, and we have our own idea of what contemplative might mean. But it's quite a broad term, and there's quite a lot of different practices that you could call contemplative. So for this first part, you can see just from the list there, things like centering prayer and Ignatian prayer in Christianity. In Buddhism, you've got deity yoga, vipassana and meditation types. In Islam, remembrance. You've got some secular practices as well, MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, obviously, is quite a popular. John Kabat-Zinn's formulation of mindfulness for stress in the clinical situation. The relaxation response, another secular approach. But you'll notice that, when you look into these, they tend to all draw from contemplative traditions that have been going on for centuries, millennia. So that's quite, I think it's important to be aware of the breadth of contemplative practice, partly as well because when I'm giving the presentation, I'm coming from a very specific background, which I'll go through in a while. So I want you to be aware of that. Although my formulation might be quite personal, I think the contemplative practice and contemplative listening can be much wider as well. So it could be asked, how can you categorize different types of contemplative experience? And I think it's quite useful to have a look at the different ways in which you could draw different practices together in ways. So you could look at methods of practice, typologies of practice. So here we've got some broad categories that you might be able to fit those contemplative activities into. So cataphatic practice, which is conceptual, content-based. So here we're using thinking and consciousness as part of the practice. And then you'll see the opposite on the other side. Apophatic is a kind of one of the dyads or pairs of terms we might use. So this is kind of more non-conceptual, contentless states of mind. So you might well think of, Zen Buddhist practice, for example, as being largely based on that kind of non-conceptual, contentless states of consciousness. You've got communal and solitary practices. You've got ecstatic practices where practitioners go beyond or outside of themselves, and that often relates to an experience of God, the divine, some kind of transcendent view of the practice. Whereas enstatic on the other side, maybe it's again more of a feeling of going inwards, creating that kind of interior space, and often has associations with a more immanent view of the divine or transcendence. And then largely, we've also got ergotropic. So these are kind of in columns, and there are some similarities between the different practices in cataphatic, communal, ecstatic, and ergotropic, but they're not completely distinct. You can sort of mix and match from these two columns. Ergotropic is much more to do with kind of arousal. It's much more to do with kind of movement, activity, whereas trophotropic is much more inward, less movement involved, perhaps physiologically, just sort of calmer, quieter type of approach. So that's one way we can look at contemplative practice, and again, just showing the broad, some of the broad categories you can put these into. In terms of methods, there is another way of categorizing them, and instead of using the methods that people use in contemplative practice, is to look at the goals that they might look to attain, the kind of states they might want to attain, perhaps, although there's a caveat with that. So it could be unitive, it could be removing that distinction between the divine or the sacred and the adherent, the practitioner. It could be dualistic in terms of it's really about there was this unbridgeable gap between yourself and the divine, but yet there is some means of communication there. Alchemical, so again, something I don't know so much about, if I'm honest, but concerned with the transmutation of matter, and that the goal in some practices, contemplative practices, might be to do with that changing the state of matter. And mediumistic, where it may be that someone is possessed or channeling some kind of divine power or spirit. So they're kind of four goals in a sense, or what do you want to achieve? It always seems the wrong term, but what's the goal of this contemplative practice? And also, I think within this, you maybe need to look beyond the immediate goals to look at long-term aspirations of these practitioners, because I think, particularly if you within Zen Buddhist practice, it's having mystical experiences, having visions, or having other types of religious experience can often be seen as getting in the way of the practice. That they become people become sidetracked, and it's sometimes an unhelpful byproduct of the practice. So I think it's important that we also see that when we talk about goals, for some people that might be the case, but for a lot of people, the goals are just a byproduct. They're things that happen along the path of contemplative practice, which I think I would place myself in that category. So moving on from, hopefully that's given you an idea of the kind of some of the contemplative practices and how we might group those. I think there are some common sort of themes that run through a lot of contemplative practices. So things like attentiveness. A lot of people mention focus in the chat at the beginning. So there's a kind of focus or unfocus in a sense of being open and having much more an expansive awareness. It could be interiority, so going inwards is often the case in contemplative practice. A sense of presence, of being truly present with whatever's going on. Silence, probably unsurprisingly, comes into the mix as well. Is that a lot of contemplative practices draw on silence. That's a huge topic that I'm not going to go into. There's a PhD, if anyone wants a copy, give me a shout. But there is a huge a relationship with silence in some way with contemplative practice that tends to run through different types of practice. Some kind of transformation is another thing. So people, the contemplative practice is a means of having some kind of often internal transformation in that process, and also a deep sense of meaning and purpose. So I think that's something that comes through in a lot of people's practice, especially over time. Maybe in Buddhism we might call that insight, a direct insight into the nature of being, and that, in a sense, again, you find throughout lots of different contemplative traditions, is that development of direct experience of meaning rather than something thought through necessarily. So moving on to listening, because we've looked at contemplative and what that might mean, and as I said, it's quite a broad term. Listening is something, I think Pauline Oliveros often talks about this, is listening is a way of actively directing our attention. So we hear all sorts of things, but we may only listen to a selection of things that are going on in our environment. So when we talk about listening, we're talking about that focused awareness to some degree, or at least if our awareness is broad, we're aware of that broad listening, that exploratory listening. But we can only really listen to one thing at any one time. We might be hearing all sorts of things, but we can only direct our attention to one sound at one time, and that's what we call listening. Soundscape is another word that comes up a lot, and that's really just a focus on sounds in the environment. This could mean anything. It could be music, speech, other forms of organized and structured sound in the environment. But that's a term that we use for whatever we're hearing in whatever environment we're in. And within that, we might also hear ergo audition, which is our own sound making. So some practices, and we'll look at a few later, that actually look at paying attention to our own sound making, whether that's the breath or walking and the like. So it's the sounds that we choose to make, or we make as we're as living beings. And then listening with is a term that Mark Peter Wright, his book, his quite recent book on listening after nature, really looks at listening with, which is kind of expands the listening. So it's not just about what we're listening to in the immediate environment, but it's what we're listening to beyond that. So we could be using our imaginations, in a sense, to look at the history of sound, or it could be a sound that we think of when we're listening to something. It could be a sound that is beyond the immediate in some way. So that's kind of listening with, rather than listening to or for something that we can definitely hear in the environment. And then endophonic sound, which is interesting. I've used that term, and I think it's a useful term, because there's a term called audiation, but which is an auditory imagination. It's this thought sound that we have going on in our heads almost constantly. So that is again, we can draw on that as part of our sound practice. Again, Pauline Oliveros, so I'll come to you later, does a lot of work with what she might call audiation, or endophonic sound, and this sound of our minds. And then lastly, field recording. So again, Mark Peter Wright writes an exploration of the acoustic worlds of humans and non-humans through the capture, construction, and mediation of sound. So field recording, often people will think of some person with a microphone or a funny looking device, capturing a soundscape or a particular sound within that. I think it's been a part of my practice for many years, and I've tried to integrate that within the contemplative listening that I do, not only with myself, but with participants of all walks of life and ages. And so that's been really a really useful tool, I think, in extending our listening by using a technology to capture, to construct new maybe compositions, new soundscapes perhaps, and just generally to work with sounds in other ways. So the next section really is still looking at contemplative listening and field recording. I think what we can do with field recording is take that a little step further. So as I said, you can be in contact with the sound directly in front of you through different types of microphone, which we perhaps call the contact zone, which is where the microphone is placed or what we're capturing. And that can be beyond the human hearing. So if it could be ultra high frequencies or very low frequencies. It could be hydrophones that you put in water and you listen to the sounds within a river or a pond. It could be all sorts of other ways of interacting with the environment. But also looking at elsewhere fields in that as well. So ways in which we might be able to capture, maybe through writing, maybe in other ways, maybe not using that tech, but ways in which we can capture what we're hearing in some way. So for example, one exercise I did was to record my own thought sound as I was sweeping. I did a project all on sweeping my house. And it was the sounds and the thoughts that I was having while I was sweeping. And that was kind of interesting because you're then sort of brain dumping, in a sense, all of your of what's going on in your head at the same time as you're capturing what's going on in the environment. You can see the kind of interrelation of how your thinking interacts with this sort of sound environment. So I think obviously I think it's important that I've sort of outlined those three things. We've looked at contemplative, what that might mean. We've looked at listening and also field recording and getting a sense of what those terms mean. And going back to sort of contemplative traditions, Louis Kumjavi, who I've again, he's written some excellent books. Contemplative literature that we've got here is a really good book that looks at all sorts of different traditions and the contemplative traditions within different faiths. But he says the term contemplative traditions is thus not intended to function in a manner parallel to wisdom traditions or spirituality in various modern contexts, wherein intellectual colonialism, appropriation, domestication, as well as decontextualization and reconceptualization are involved, some big words there. But there is that sense of that some traditions may draw upon the wisdom of the traditions of others from other cultures and from other from other parts of the world, and embed those. And there is a whole body of work around, obviously, colonialism, post-colonialism, and our use of those. In this case, the use of those contemplative practices for example, mindfulness-based stress reduction, or the transcendental meditation, and how we use those practices from other places and other peoples in our own, for our own ends. But I think as well, and the formulation of contemplative listening that I talking about here is really to do with this end section. Contemplative practice is always rooted in a particular worldview, in a community context and tradition. And I think sometimes that often gets forgotten with these other traditions, where they borrow quite liberally from other places. That's not to say that isn't a natural part of being human in a sense, but sometimes by taking things out of context, by taking them from them without honouring the meaning and the context in which they were practiced, that it can be quite disrespectful. But also you can lose something really important about the essence of those practices. So in the work that I'm sort of forwarding here, I really want to now just give you a kind of context of where I'm coming from, so that when you look at the work, you can see perhaps the influences the kind of choices that I've made and some of the influences that I've had. So I think that's it's quite important to sort of triangulate in terms of all the different subjectivities that I'm presenting in a way, and that others would present, and we can sort of compare and contrast and come up with some understanding. So I think there is that kind of fallacy of objectivity in a lot of the research, and I really don't I want to say straight out, this is where I'm coming from, this is me, and obviously you might see that in the work that I'm presenting here. And I think it's good to be honest about that and not pretend that this is somehow some objective, you know, a piece of research. So I think obviously, first of all, that my practice is primarily Buddhist. Saying that, I grew up within the Methodist Church. I practiced a long time with the Quakers, and from that moved into the Plum Village tradition of Buddhism, which I still, well, now an aspirant of. I think there's professional roles involved as well. So I come from, obviously I'm a teacher in music production primarily, and then listening and field recording from there. But also I'm a healthcare chaplain. And so I do come with that. Again, that's some experience of being in a healthcare setting, in a caring setting in the hospital. The cultural background, obviously I'm white, male, British, parents, I've got 3 daughters, and and really come from kind of a middle class background. And I think that also you need to be aware of that when you're writing and when you're you know, we're presenting these things, so that you can be aware of the limitations of what I'm presenting and the limits of my own view, and hopefully spare you on to, you know, and for me certainly to spare me on to try and find people from other you know, from other backgrounds, so that I can keep what, you know, my own thinking in check. Embracing all diversity, I think is really important. So all diversity is one of those quite hot topics at the moment, I suppose, is that we always think that with the way we listen is pretty much the same for everyone. There's a kind of standard way that we all listen. Our listening and our ears hearing is so different for so many different people. There is no oral typical kind of listening. So I think it's important that, again, that I take that on board. Practice-based methodology is the way I'm coming from. So I'm a practitioner primarily, and then I, you know, obviously with the reading and interviews and trying to develop work from that sort of that point of view. So, and this is really what I want to do now is to look at my kind of practice and give you some examples, some concrete examples of the types of practices that I might call contemplative listening, practices that I do myself, but also participatory practices with others. Because I think from that, hopefully you'll get a sense of what contemplative listening might be, and then we can draw out some themes from that. So moving on to the types of practices. So some examples: listening meditations, where we might use sound as a means, as something to focus on in a meditation. Graphic and text scores are a very popular way of directing attention and exploring a sound environment. So we'll look at some examples of those. Contemplative field recording practices, so ways of extending our listening into different environments and using technology to listen in ways that we couldn't normally. Creative activities that are responding directly to listening. So it could be, you know, writing, even for sort of photography, composition, as it says in the bottom there, giving music, soundscape composition, other forms of creative response to listening. I think it's important to notice the relationship here when we've mentioned listening meditations to balance that with an understanding of meditation itself. Informal meditation, often that for me is a practice of sitting meditation. We have got the space to experience ourselves beyond our impulses to create. So it's often a focus that may draw you inwards. It may, whether it's on the breath, or a particular sound that we're focused on, or listening exercise. It's there. It can be there to help us to focus, rather than an opportunity to create or to think about the sound in some way, or to follow it in a kind of creative way. And it's not an opportunity to alter it, to play with it in some way. So I think there is a kind of distinction between meditation, which is using sound primarily really to focus and to calm, and to come into a space that is maybe a stillness, and then with other practices, it may be being more outward, or involved in creative activities, in listening in quite creative ways. So I think the two aren't separate. They can come together in various ways, but I think there is a difference in the kind of mindset of creative outward manipulation of sound and playing with sound, and then the much more meditative approach of awareness of sound and listening, and using that as a way of coming back to ourselves largely. So as I mentioned, it's kind of a flexible relationship with formal meditation, that they're not completely separate, but I think we have to be careful how we use those two, because they have kind of different goals in a sense, or at least they have different, they're quite different approaches often. So, and being aware of how they inform our own sense of stillness, or of awareness, is important. I think contemplative listening is not a unified method or approach. I don't think it's one of those, there's not one way of practicing. I think that's important to say at the outset. This is something I've formulated. I don't think I know the definitive, it's not any kind of definitive body of work in terms of contemplative listening. I have no wish to use contemplative listening and trademark it, or to make it a nice sellable product. Much to my wife's disappointment, probably. It's context specific, so I think it's one of those things, and this the practices that I'm going to explore now, they're very much related to my own practice and to my and to the context that I'm in. Again, I think people can take ideas and use them elsewhere, but I think it's important that they're not sort of systematized, packaged, and just wholesale given to someone else. I think they need to be contextualized. So mine might be quite informed by my own Buddhist practice. If I was to work with with Christian practitioners, it may be that actually what I'm doing is not transferable in a way. Some of it might be, but I think it's important that we contextualize these kind of practices, and I'll talk about more of that at the end. The person-to-person transmissions is important. I think books and websites and YouTube videos are great, but I really have found over the years that it's very important that the practices are embodied, that you get a sense for how the practice works. And I think it's very difficult sometimes to do that without being in person. I think Zoom does a wonderful job when we can't be together, but I think partly this localization in the sense of some of the practices is really quite wonderful, because you get the 360 version of the practitioner, and some of the things that aren't conveyed easily through other media. And also that it's countercultural in many respects. So I think the practice of contemplative listening, I've got this quote here, which kind of talks about the naturalist Henry David Thoreau, and how he was politically suspect insofar as his interests seemed to run counter to a social and economic order that was primarily based on the subjugation of nature. But he was more fundamentally suspect because his business, like that of the philosopher or artist, seemed to be essentially contemplative. He was in the business of seeing, of wandering the countryside, of observing. and his seeing seemed to produce no useful results. And I think that's really quite an interesting quote, because and quite an interesting practice, because it is we're so used to having putting effort into a practice and to get results. Maybe that's a piece of art, or a composition. Maybe that's other forms of work. I think it's quite a countercultural thing to think that we don't necessarily aren't going to get anything from it immediately, or even in the long run. Sometimes it would feel sometimes. So I think there is that sense of, even I found when I'm out listening, people will find that quite a strange thing to do if I'm sitting there listening with a microphone, or often people think you're working for the BBC or some other media company. But I think that's important to own that, and actually I'm not doing anything. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to listen. But it does, when you're doing it, it feels like quite a countercultural activity that's quite strange, quite a bizarre thing to do in a world that's so focused on the business of production and results. So I think that's again something that I find with when you're working with participants, they really find quite difficult. I remember when I was worked with some intensive care unit staff recently on a series of contemplative listening workshops. And one of the things they said was that it was the guilt that I'm not doing anything productive. And they felt it was really hard for them to sit there, to enjoy the quiet of a meditation, to do some qigong, to do some field recording, to do some contemplative photography, without any real hard result. They felt that they weren't helping anyone or caring for people. I think was what am I doing this for? And there was a sense of guilt that they were enjoying themselves doing it as well, which I thought was really interesting, and a real eye-opener for the state of our society, that we have so much difficulty justifying that time to ourselves that we might want to spend with a contemplative activity, or just not being productive. So here's a lovely painting. It actually comes from a book. There's a couple of books here that I'd quite highly recommend, by David Hinton, Hunger Mountain and Existence. They're really beautiful books. David Hinton has a way of writing that is really engaging, and he uses examples like this one of Chinese landscape painting and Chinese characters. Has a real depth of knowledge on these things. But really importantly, I think encapsulates that sense of presence and the contemplative nature of this kind of artwork, but also of his own listening and experience. I'm going to just read something that he wrote to accompany this picture, just as we're looking at it. Millennia of Chinese culture's spiritual and artistic insight, Shi Tao's lifetime of landscape practice. If we could distill all of that into the moment portrayed in this painting, a moment we are invited to share, for we are meant to identify with the gazer, aren't we? It would look something like this. We walk to a mountaintop, face out across ridgeline beyond ridgeline, then close our eyes. We forget everything we know, all of the ideas and knowledge and assumptions about ourselves and the nature of things, all of the thoughts and memories defining us each as a center of identity. We turn to the empty darkness of pure awareness, which is all that remains after this practice of forgetfulness, and we inhabit the expansive space of that darkness. And I think ever since I've looked at Chinese landscape paintings in a completely different light, I think from after reading his books and understanding something of what's being communicated. I think it's a very direct style often. I think that quote really says it begins with a moment of awareness. And in closing our eyes, it feels as though we are invited to listen as well as turn inward. You can see that character standing on the ridge there, gazing across the mountains. There's that kind of sense that he's looking outwards, but also turning inwards in some sense. And in forgetting what we know, we can quieten our thinking, halt the stories we tell about ourselves, and loosen our attachment to this body in this place. I think that's something beautiful about contemplative practice and meditation, is that we can quieten that thinking, that we can just halt that narrative. I think psychologists call it the narrative identity, those stories we tell about ourselves in order to formulate this person I call Richard. And I think it's quite liberating to for example, in this, to have that expansive awareness, but also to lose that sense, lose that narrative for a moment, and to just rest in awareness. Inhabiting that space of darkness that he talks about, we can rest in pure awareness. And that's more expansive than this small sense of me or I, and feel connected to the huge expanse of the mountain ridges there. So I think a lot of our practice, a lot of the practices that I sort of deliver and practice myself are very much about starting, in a sense, with paying attention to sound as a means of coming back to myself, coming back to some kind of awareness of what's going on now. I think they can be really useful, and sound has a lovely transience about it. It always seems quite interesting. It's never stays the same. So that there is a kind of open curiousness that I think that listening can enable. So I think that's often where it begins to guide us back to the present moment, to listen and to know what's going, and to hear what's going on in the environment can be quite beautiful. And I think often you'd hear in meditation about it being non-judgmental. Yes, I think that's important, not to judge. Oh, I'm not doing this right, I'm doing it wrong. I don't like that sound, I do like that sound. I think those things can get in the way of this kind of just paying attention to what sound is there. But I think there's also a sense, and I always find with mindfulness practice that what's not mentioned much is that sense of care. And I think, again, if I'm mindful about what I'm eating, I'm caring about the way I'm eating. I'm caring about the food, I'm caring about the table, the people I'm with. And I think that's really important, that within all of the practices that there is this sense of care and attention being paid. There is no set, in saying that, there's no kind of set toolbox or set sequence in which things should happen. I think generally I get people to listen outwards first, just because it's often more engaging and it's more natural than going inwards. But hopefully, and also by familiarizing ourselves with the sound, we can come back to ourselves and feel a bit more settled, having been familiarized with what's going on around us. I think there are, and again, I'm talking about practices as if it's something that I instigate, but I think there is another way of looking at that. Is that sometimes it's not me that instigates it, it's the soundscape that actually instigates my listening and makes me come back to the present. Which I think one of the books, I've forgotten which one it is, but talks of something called a flash of perception. It's something that just grabs your attention. But then obviously we'll look at a few examples now of cultivated presence, of ways in which we can use listening to cultivate that sense of presence and awareness. Here's an example of a flash of perception I had probably a couple of months ago now, actually, during a thunderstorm. And this is down the road in Wallingford, where I live in South Oxfordshire. And I was just walking out of this alley, and then I came out the other side to hear something like this. And it was just I don't suppose you get that so much from that recording, because that was done slightly afterwards, but the thunder was there, the rain, all of a sudden after coming through that alleyway, just opened up into this mass of shimmering rain on the roof, drips coming down into the brook there. And it just halted me in my, halted me in the steps, and I just had to stop and listen. And so I think sometimes the environment does that to us. It actually, we don't need to put any effort in. the soundscape will do that for us. And here's a little quote from Andy Carr, Michael Wood here. The first characteristic of this flash of perception arises all of a sudden out of the blue. In the flow of ordinary activity, reading, talking, having lunch, there is an unexpected break. Suddenly something fresh occurs in a definite and unmistaken way. Because the transition is sudden, it is also shocking. It comes as a bit of a jolt. You've been shaken out of your vagueness and into the moment because it is abrupt and disconnected from previous mental activity. The flash is subtly disorienting. The immediate perception is free from association or context. Usually our experience is embedded in a storyline, which is itself taking place within the world of our projections. The flash of perception is free from both storyline and reference point. And to some degree, I think that does explain, describe that kind of experience. That it felt quite shocking in some sense to come out into that soundscape. And I also felt that the thunder as well just drew me outwards in a way that I was quite focused on going shopping, if I'm honest, going through the alleyway, and then all of a sudden the thunder, the soundscape just brought my attention. It took it outwards, and my world was that much bigger at that point. So that's a sort of an example of this kind of flash of perception. In terms of some of the listening exercise that I do, I'm just going to work through some ways in which I might engage myself, but also other people in contemplative listening. So here's an example, again, local church in Wallingford. And I found that with this example, I sat and I listened to the soundscape first of all, listened to the various bleeps and traffic noise, to everything reverberating around this huge space. As it says in the little quote there as well, that the birds seem to fall from the rafters. Some of the beeping sounds that are from a reversing signal seem to resonate as if they were playing the organ. And there was just this kind of moment of sort of creative listening, in a sense, of familiarizing myself with the soundscape, but also feeling quite connected with it and in some way. And then from there went through various activities with field recording and using geophones, which really record very low frequency sound. And moving around the space, using geophone instead of my ears to find interesting sounds around there, and just engaging me in the space and drawing my attention and focus to what was going on in the present moment, rather than the various other things that I could have been thinking about at the time. So here's a quote from, we're talking about that writing that I do, and often it is those little tweet-sized bits of writing that try and encapsulate something of the experience of listening in a place. But there was always something lacking. It was interesting, I came across this quote from Thomas Merton that seemed to hit the nail on the head sometimes with this. It says, I have to write in the awareness that there is something lacking. And when I do so, when the mind is stirred and perceives things before, just going to move this out of the way, so I can't. For as objective thought, it will find in itself something lacking. Astavakrus Gita, to find this something lacking is already a beginning of wisdom. Ignorance seeks to make good the lacking with better or more complete or more mysterious objects. The lack itself will be complete as void, not to deny subject and object, but to realize them as void. I think that's it. You're always trying with these kind of creative, so often with the creativity that ensues from these kind of listenings, there's always something lacking. There is always that kind of void. There's always that experience of something that's not present. And I think honoring that and recognizing that is important as trying to capture something of the essence of a space in a recording or in a composition. But to know that there's something lacking, the void that is there is also an important part of the experience. So writing about sound is one way of, and listening is one way of, one technique that I use. Another one is this mindful listening score, which I can put up in the chat later if anyone wants a copy. but it's a way of directing our attention out into the soundscape, but also to our body and our breath as well. So you'll notice on here you've got it's like a traditional score in many senses, but the different circles and the arrows within the circles tell us where to direct our attention, whether it's omnidirectional out into the soundscape, whether it sounds close by, whether it sounds in the body or listening to the breath, or listening to the sounds of thoughts as well, this endophonic sound that I mentioned earlier. And listening in different directions. Some people find this a bit like reading a score. It's quite a lot of effort in a sense to do that. And I think if you give that a try, you'll notice that it takes some staying power to stay with focused attention in a particular direction. So very much like meditation, but equally, some people have found it a very interesting way of exploring the environment, but also coming back to themselves at the same time when you're listening to the breath. And it kind of plays with that movement of auditory attention. So I've tried it with various, the ICU, at the top of the photograph is the ICU staff that I worked with. And in the bottom, there was a Earth Living Festival, which is based in Reading. And we did this exercise there. And it did seem to, people seem to really enjoy and really engage with the soundscape. So that's another mindful listening score, another means of interacting with the environment. I've mentioned field recording as well. And there's something about going around with a microphone that re-enlivens your listening because you hear things in a different way. For example, here, I think it's Jodie there, is looking at is listening very closely to the air conditioning. Something you would walk past. In any other time of the day, you wouldn't pay any attention. Yet with a field recording device, the auditory sense is dominating. And you just go and find it. You will find all sorts of sounds that you find interesting with the device, but you wouldn't normally. And I think that's a lovely way of engaging people with everyday sound, with the mundane sounds that we pass by. We have a habit, obviously, of labeling sounds and then forgetting about them. Once our brains have understood what the sound is, we don't need to pay any more attention. And so we don't. And I think breaking that using field recording equipment is such a beautiful thing to do. I work with some Key Stage 1 children with these little devices, and just to see their face light up when they I remember this one guy was just splashing in a puddle, had the field recording device right near his feet and just moving his feet in the puddle, and the look on his face was just amazing. It was just so entranced, so present with what was going on, because it was a new experience for him of listening that closely to something that he would pass by every day. So field recording, I think, has a really interesting way of bringing us back to the present and to our own listening. Here's another example by a friend of mine who lives in Canada, Claude Squire, who's one of the very few people I found that do have a similar practice to me. Have a listen and a watch. So Claude, it runs you can look up a lot more of these videos on simple soundscapes. He's I'm pretty sure he's a Zen Buddhist practitioner, but chose to, and also a sound artist, but chose to explore sound and the environment, but with videos. He felt that giving videos context, giving the context of the sound, just helped to draw people in. So it has all sorts of very mundane sounds in many respects that are presented with video in order to sort of gently engage the person. You'll notice there's a whole movement around slow media of sorts. So there's a sort of a slow TV and slow radio you might come across, where often very slowly developing soundscapes or videos can be very relaxing, I think, and calming. and just very gently engaging. And I find that in a similar way, Claude's videos sort of draw you in a strange way that you, again, would probably not engage with otherwise. Another example of interacting with the space here. So this is with some participants we went into a church, and I just asked them to sound the space, to actually get a sense of the acoustics and the size of the space by making sound. So we used various percussion instruments here, and just have a quick listen of them exploring, and not, so it's not just the sounds in the space, but the sound of the space itself that's drawing our attention and focusing it on the present. So another way of, along with sounding the space, is actually to sound materials and play spaces, play the materials that are in spaces. And again, it just gets us to connect with the materials in the space, the objects in the space, in a way that we wouldn't normally. And again, you have to have a fair amount of confidence to do this sometimes, to go up to a gate and start playing it with some mallets. But you come up with some quite interesting results. Here's an example of something I did a project around the canal, and I was doing some field recording around Oscar Wilde Walk, where Oscar Wilde was incarcerated in Reading jail, and just outside there's the Kennet River and some gates that just made some quite beautiful sounds. And then funny enough, a friend of mine picked up on this and wrote some poetry during lockdown. It's quite dark, but I'll just give you a flavour of that now, of how you can actually use those sounds in a composition, but also just connect with the various materials in a space using field recording.
The darkness is absolute. The silence total. Only death moves between the worlds. In the moments between time, watching. Always in the right place. Always at the right time. For the big deaths and the small. The ended friendships. The lost loves. The old, the young, the brothers and sisters, parents, sons, daughters, all succumb. The absolute is silent, the total is darkness. Always between the worlds, out of time, death moves.
So I was glad to have that, used it quite a thoughtful piece of work by David Yates. But the immediate for me was just that connection with the metal, that sense that you were playing and interacting with the environment in that way just connects you very quickly to an environment. In a similar way, now we've looked at sort of listening to the environment in different ways, but also listening to your body in different ways. Here's I'll just play a snippet of the snow walking meditation that I recorded. Again, a very simple act sometimes of putting a microphone near your feet, as I said, with that young boy playing in a puddle. But equally, when we're walking on different surfaces, we don't take notice of those things until perhaps we have we've amplified that and it becomes really present to us. So that's one, again, one way of interacting with the body. There's various others that I've tried, for example, listening to the soundscape and just using your ribs as a kind of what I call a ribophone, and just actually responding via touch to what's going on in the soundscape, using sense of vibration and actually feeling vibration in the soundscape, particularly in noisy environments. That works well. Humming pitches or responding vocally to what's going on. Mimicry is quite a good way of connecting the body and the breath with what's going on in the soundscape. But here's another one that I used was for sweeping. So when I sweep, I tend to use this gatha, this little poem, mindfulness poem in a sense, to remind myself to be present with the sweeping sound and the act of sweeping, connecting what I'd normally do while thinking about 101 other things, like when I've got to pick the kids up or what we're having for dinner, and actually just using this to try and focus on what I'm doing. So it says this sweeping sound removes separation, lifetimes of forgetfulness recalled in an instant. That sense of just coming back to the present and listening to that sweeping sound. It's amazing what you pick up as well. I do sweep in a very particular way, a very methodical way. It's funny when you listen to it how you can sense that in the actual sound itself, probably passed on from generation to generation down the family, I'd imagine. Another thing to watch out for, I suppose, is this kind of sense of an important aspect of practice is not knowing what's going to happen next, not that expectation. When you're out field recording or listening, often we try and predict what's going to happen in the environment. Here's a little quote from the Book of Equanimity. I think is quite beautiful. It says, Zhang asked Fayan, "Where are you going?" Fayan said, "Around on pilgrimage." Zhang said, "What is the purpose of pilgrimage?" Fayan said, I don't know. Zhang said, "Not knowing is most intimate." And what a beautiful little poem that really sums up that, for me, sums up the importance of not knowing, of not having that expectation of what I'm going to find, what I'm going to listen to be open to what might happen, because that's most intimate. That's when you're really connected with something. And often we let our predictive minds get in the way of that experience and not being open to it. So in terms of endophagy of our thinking sound as well, I think it's, there's sometimes that expectation gets in the way, but also there's this in Buddhist iconography, you'll often find this in the center of the Wheel of Life, is that three characters, the cockerel, the snake, and the pig. And I think that actually tells us it was useful in looking at the way that we think about sound. So the cockerel is the icon for attachment. Grasping. So we often, when we're out, we grasp at sounds we like. But it's interesting to say, well, why do we like that? What is it about that sound? We free ourselves from expectations. I've just said I should be good at this. When you're out listening or doing an activity, often the sounds that you hear is, well, I should be good at this. I should be able to do this. I need to show someone this recording. It's got to be good. It's, there's often that with artists, there is that kind of sense of this this attachment to an idea of how the work should end up, without actually freeing ourselves up and thinking about what's in front of us. And I think that's important in contemplative listening, is to not get too bogged down with what the end result would be, but actually be open to what's going on in that moment. So things like the outcome, as I've just mentioned, but also comparison with others. I should, my recording isn't as good as so-and-so's, or it's not going to be up to scratch in order to share with this. So there's that kind of sense of attachment to how we think things should be. Then there's the snake, which is aversion, which is like pushing things away. So when you see this, see the snake in Buddhist iconography in this way, eating each other's tails, it's kind of expectations of the soundscape. So I don't like that. I'm pushing that sound away. It's ruining, the sound of chatting or a plane is ruining my recording. And you try and push it away rather than think, okay, the plane is part of going over, is part of the soundscape. And can I come to a place where I'm actually embracing that, or at least, accepting that it's there? And that dislike of sound. So often I've had sounds in the past that I've disliked. A washing machine was one of them. My wife finds that really difficult. But but actually I've recorded a washing machine as part of a slow media project, and it was fascinating to listen and to see if I could, to accept some of the sounds that I might find really difficult. There's a story of my teacher who passed away earlier in the year, Thich Nhat Hanh, who was on a retreat, who was finding it very difficult to concentrate. They all were, because a lot of them are from Vietnam, either ex-military or were monks and nuns from Vietnam. And they were in this retreat, they were really near an air base where helicopters were going to, leaving the base, going overhead. And they found it incredibly difficult to meditate while this sound was happening because of the associations with the war. But he integrated that within the meditations, a way of being aware of the way we feel when we listen to that kind of sound. So I think that's it is a practice of being aware of how we're feeling when we're listening to that sound. I'm not saying there are points at which you don't need to stand up and walk out. That might be the case, but at other points there may be the opportunity to work with the sound and to change your relationship with that in some way. And then last of all, the pig or the boar. So this is where patterns of listening come into play. What am I not hearing is something that Mark Peter Wright talks about a lot. When we're listening, our patterning is to hear certain things in the environment, to listen to certain things. And it's quite often, you say, well, what am I not listening to? What am I choosing to ignore? And I think that's quite an important practice when we're taking part in contemplative listening, is what's the pattern of my listening? And can I sit with my own boredom? So some some soundscapes are quite dull, or there's not a lot going on in them. So how can I actually embrace that, or at least recognize that feeling within myself, and work with that? Here's a quote. So boredom is merely a symptom that you haven't opened your eyes wide enough. And I think sometimes there is that sense of, if I listen for longer, or if I just sit with that boredom, actually sometimes you do find that there is interest where you didn't think there was. A bit like when we were talking about the sounds that we pass every day because we think they're not interesting. If we listen in different ways, we can actually often find interest where we didn't know there was any. Here's one example of a fridge. I did an exhaustive listening exercise in an old disused shop. Just when you thought you'd managed to exhaust all of the sounds, I put a contact microphone on the back of the fridge. It was still just about working in there. Strangely like a frog, but quite a beautiful find. So I'm aware that that we have gone on a little while, or I have gone a little while. I do want to just quickly go through, if we have time, just to go through some of the features of contemplative listening that I find that draws some of these practices together, and some of the some of the listenings that I've done, and the creative practice around contemplative listening seems to draw these qualities or features seem to be drawn out from it. So we're going to quick look at presence, perspective, not knowing, we've touched on that, non-violence, wonder, non-conceptuality, simplicity, silence, and community. Here's a little video. We're talking about presence that always reminds me every time I load up my website, this video plays. And I often just have to sit there and watch it. Okay, there's a real sense of presence and connection with people using the video. So I really feel that there's it's an exercise I do, and when we're in groups sometimes is just to when we're talking about silence and presence, is just to look into someone's eyes. An incredibly difficult thing for some people to do, You have to be very careful when you're doing it. But again, with this video, it's just a lovely connection, and to hear the sounds around as well, is that it's almost like it has a different soundtrack each time you play it. So we talk about that. That's the kind of presence and being present with things. Oh, sorry, is that a? And I'm just very quickly want to look at the sense of perspective. So sometimes the listening can take you out, as I said, with the thunder, takes you out into the soundscape and pushes your listening and your awareness into the distance. And then other times as well, you go into a space like the church and you get this sense of history and that sense of a connection with perhaps ancestry, or with a sense of the past. And I think there's something wonderful about, there's some work done on psychological distancing and I forgot what it's called. I'll just have a quick look here actually. It's that sense of openness and expansiveness that you get with listening sometimes to a soundscape that's huge. Imagine things like being up on mountains or moors with the wind. You've got that, it changes your perspective, I think, often, if you listen carefully. And I think that it's also you're changing perspective, because the sound almost encourages you to do that. They've done a lot of studies with visual perspective. So changing into looking at great big landscapes, for example, changes the way you think, and you think more abstractly and more broadly. This psychological distancing. And I think the same thing happens with sound, but also it happens with time, I feel, as well, and that sense of spiritual connection. I'll pop that one in, but again, we've looked at this, but not knowing that sense of that expecting is that it's important to not know, to go with an open mind, and to not know what's about to happen. Not to go in expecting, using those same patterns of thinking all the time. We talk about non-violence. I think in the eco sonic approach of looking actually what's the impact of my field recording practice. So here's one of the field recorders I've got, and you notice lots of words that are quite aggressive. Capture, we're going to capture sound. We're going to record, monitor, control. They're all quite aggressive terms. And often when you're working with technology, it can become quite functional. You're monitoring an environment, you're choosing which aspects to record, you're capturing sound and taking it away to do something with. It can be quite a violent language, not to over-egg this, but I think sometimes that attitude of control, of making the perfect recording of quality, can get in the way of actually being present with the sound. Then wonder, being open to what's in front of us, I think is a really important quality of contemplative listening practice. And this sense of wonder sometimes go with the strangest discoveries. Here's a guy called Mike Medallion, funny, illustrator for a lot of books with mindful illustrations of poetry. But just he got really connected. We were in the Quaker meeting house, and he got very connected with this radiator that was there, and felt like he had a relationship with it through the sounds that it was making. He was almost having a conversation with it, which was quite lovely. Another one I found was this radiator in Paris. Again, had a strange, couldn't get to sleep, but actually listening to it more carefully, it was really quite a beautiful sound. Non-conceptual, again, just thinking about we're so used to thinking about what sound is that, what labeling things, thinking about these sound objects. And I think sometimes there's that approach of listening to the qualities of the sound itself, rather than getting tied up with the actual object, or naming it, or thinking about how you're going to use it. I think it's really quite important part of the process and the feature of contemplative listening. And also the simplicity of just being open to, as I said, open to everyday sounds, I think is a really important part of contemplative listening. Here there was the remnants of what I swept up during the project where I was listening to myself sweeping. But just engaging as part of your everyday practice. So I think it's important that contemplative listening becomes something that you do as part of a wider practice of mindfulness of every day. And also that the community, I think, is a really important aspect of it. I could say a lot more about this, but I think there's something that I find with a contemplative practice that needs to be embedded within a wider community of people that maybe not have an interest in sound or listening or even art. But I found it through my work with workshops, the funding, having a very short period of time with people, having very, very focused sessions, but not having that ongoing support afterwards, or not having anywhere to go with the practice once you've had that workshop. For some people that might be enough, but for people that for a sort of for contemplative listening practice to really grow and develop, I think it's so important that you have that sense of community, that, as it says there, you've got you're with people that are familiar with contemplative practice, that you've got some ethical framework in which to live, some understanding of the soteriological nature, what is the salvation, what is the goal, in a sense, or what is the process that we're undergoing, of non-arts based contemplative practice, having that organizational support and teachers and collective peer support that you get, which I think sometimes in workshop situations, having worked in participatory and community arts for a long time, is very difficult to put in place the length of time and the support that you might need. Silence is another important aspect of it. I'm going to slightly skip over this for the moment, because we said a hell of a lot about this, but actually a point in meditation, and you do find this after some time, is that listening can sometimes lead to silence. The thinking stops. The brain might still keep going, hopefully does, but the thinking stops. There is a silence and a quietness, and you can feel that sound may just prompt your own thinking at points, and letting go of that and being open to that kind of silence of not listening and not thinking is equally important. We talk about contemplative listening as the focus of, but I think sometimes you need to go beyond that, and it can be a way into a much deeper stillness and silence. And just ending up really with again this picture here. I think I'm going to just quote from John Dado-Laurie. The still point is at the heart of the creative process. In Zen, we access it through Zazen. The still point is like the eye of the hurricane, still, calm, even in the midst of chaos. It is not, as many believe, a void to retreat into, shutting out the world. To be still means to empty yourself from the incessant flow of thoughts and create a state of consciousness that is open and receptive. Stillness is very natural and uncomplicated. It's not esoteric in any way, yet it's incredibly profound. So I hope slightly rushed the end there, but just because I'm conscious that you've sat very very patiently through that. But I hope, as a teacher, I always feel like I should put the aims and objectives at the end. So I hope that we have explored something about what it means, what contemplative listening might mean, something about the practices that I use, and also some of the key features that I found that sort of run through a lot of those practices, both my own practice and practice with other people. So thank you very much. It's been really lovely speaking with you on a topic that in some way I've been practicing for a long time, but as I said before, it's something I haven't presented, so it was quite interesting to have an experience. So thank you very much, and I very welcome your feedback in the discussion. There was this little festive piece. I'll just play a very short snippet that I used from field recordings, and that is me in the mask, in the fox mask there, as part of an installation, a mobile installation, and we had people get in the back of this van that sort of band that we created, and play with sound toys while listening to this soundscape. And I thought it was just a festive finish to the presentation. I'll hold it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, for expanding our views of sound and music. We've spent so long, the musicians, trying to cut out all the sounds that we can't control. And thank you for letting those sounds in. Are there questions that people would like to ask? You can put a hand up, either bodily or in screen-wise. Questions and comments to put in on this. We've had some. Professor Paul, do come in, unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. I'm calling here from Texas in the USA. What a nice synchronicity. Just earlier this morning, I was reading an article in China where they have claimed to have heard, and they're listening to the universe. And I saw that great telescope, that electronic telescope in the midst. And so I'm wondering, how might this be, what you're doing here in terms of contemplative listening, be used in making contact or going on in terms of non-human intelligence within the galaxy? There's something going on around the world now where people are making exo studies or they're making connections with non-human intelligence. And it seems like what you presented here is a really good method, a practical method that could be employed with facilitating that. But, you know, the question is, how do we listen not only to the sounds within the world, but how do we listen to the cosmos?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's interesting that I don't think I can directly answer the question in some respects. I think that's beyond my my understanding. I would say, though, that I think there is, through the practice of listening and mindfulness practice, there is a very deep connection. I'm an aspirant on the order of interbeing, and the interbeing nature of existence, I think, sometimes reveals itself. The implications of that, I think, are beyond me in a sense. So I wouldn't want to venture out into territory which I have no experience of. But I do think it's very real for me. This not just an interconnection in an intellectual way, but a very deep sense of the interbeing nature of a phenomenon. And I think that's probably as much as I can say in terms of connection with the galaxy and the universe, in a sense. Mm-hmm. I do feel that there is that experience has taught me not to be too quick to tie my own understanding down and to be open to what might be possible. So yeah, thank you very much for your question. Yeah. I'll be open, obviously, to ask anyone else if they'd also like to come in on that.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that you've given us a way of possibly getting closer to it, because we've restricted our thinking a so limited way that we've shut our minds out for anything of that, Professor Paul. And I think that opening up gives us that possibility. Can I bring Sheila in with a question?
Right. When you mentioned your friend being in confinement and then writing something dark, I played with the idea of the whole pandemic being a more or less voluntary or involuntary confinement in the sense of being pregnant. And I'm curious, as a prenatal science student, has anyone made an explicit connection, or have you, Richard, if I might ask personally, to what womb life might have been for you, and in what way are you still connected like an umbilical cord to hearing these kinds of experiences?
I think that's, I mean, obviously as our hearing develops in the womb, it's one of our probably earliest senses. And I think it's also, I work with a lot with a palliative care team, and I work at the end of life. And again, hearing is one of those last senses to go. So I think we have a deep connection, obviously, with the rhythms that we hear in the womb. And I do feel that there is a deep connection, and it's often drawn to sounds, and you wonder why. And often you think, well, maybe that's one of the reasons, is because there is that sense of being held, of being warm and safe. And that all of those early connections that we make with our hearing in the womb might also inform the way we listen throughout the rest of our lives.
Has anyone written on that, or have you?
I have read. It was a while ago, but I have read some work that was around, again, that sense of connection with early associations with sound in the womb, and the rhythms. And the qualities of the sound. I'd have to try and I'll see if I can find it. It was a while ago, but no, it's a really interesting question. Thank you, Sheila. Yeah.
Thank you.
I've been in touch with Sheila Woodward when she was in South Africa, did the recordings in the womb. Of course, everything is colored by the sound of the water, but it's perfectly possible through the sound of the water also to recognize sounds coming from outside the womb. So tunes are recognizable. And that's how the Lullabies project worked, that the mother sings the lullaby before the child is born, and the child will then recognize the lullaby when the child is born. And a lot of it's associated with the heartbeat, but there are all sorts of other sounds, of course, in our bodies beyond the heartbeat. I'm going to bring Lila in for a question.
Well, first I want to say thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I mean, I loved it, and I'm so interested in field recording and in silence. And but first I would like to say something to Paul, sort of just relate to what he said, because about 20 years ago, I was sort of working on a film, and I was using NASA imagery of the sun. That was 20 years ago, and I was very, very curious about whether the sun is making sound. Is there any sound, connected with the sun? So I contacted the NASA department. I think they call it or something, which are sort of specialized in sun science, and they sent me recordings of the noise that the sun makes, and it was quite a shock initially just to hear it, because it was like it reminded me of earthquake, this sound of the earth. And I didn't know what to think of it, but then I integrated it into the video, and I just felt, the thing is, I don't have many words to describe the experience of something which is beyond words, which is a sound, but it's not about verbal talking, about verbally sort of describing things. It's about listening. So I was wondering about, I just love it. I mean, I've been recording sound with anything, since the 80s, and I edited it as part of my art videos and dance videos, just environmental sounds, because this is something that I find so inspiring. So I love your work, but I was just curious to know what you think about John Cage and his use of sound, and the 433, the piece.
Yeah, no, it's obviously was deeply inspired by the Zen practice and his experiences in Japan as well. I think there's so much to say about that piece. I'm not sure I could do it justice in any time, but I think it was beautiful in the way that it drew people's attention to what might be called non-musical sound. Playing with the audience in a sense and their expectations. As I said, there was so much to say about that. There's books worth in just that. But for me, that's the beauty of a lot of his work, was that sense of just bringing our attention in some provocative way, often to the sounds around us, to the soundscape.
I would agree with Richard on this, Lala. I mean, I think it was the most extremely prophetic work, and very exciting. I think doing much what Richard is doing, making us aware. And I think, to go back to Paul, your point really, and the point that came out, Richard, when you were talking about your recording equipment, there is much more sound in the universe than we can hear. And, thinking that even if we extend our hearing, we can't hear all of the sounds. And some of your microphones, I think, are making subsonic, the sounds below our audition and sounds even above it available to us. The book, An Immense Wonder, starts with 10 creatures in a gym. One's a snake and an elephant and a bird and a human being, and it says how the soundscape is totally different for each of those because of the range of sounds that they can hear and feel. So that notion, I think, Paul, that the sound vibration is the heart of the universe, but we can only hear a very, very limited bit of it. And to assume that we can hear all of it is another example of human arrogance, really. I mean, thank you for opening that up to us.
I was actually going to ask Professor Paul.
Yes.
It's very much a nerd question, in the sense that my knowledge of physics is very limited, but I thought that sound was only possible if you had atmosphere. Therefore, in space, you cannot have sound. So I was wondering how NASA could send you a recording of the sun, and perhaps what they record are vibrations, right? I don't know.
Well, it is. I think that it went through a process. I don't know, but this is what they sent me, and I think there is a way to. I don't have the right words again because I don't understand the science, but there is a way to translate something that, I guess, the vibrations that.
There's the relationship of light and sound, and so it's actually a densification of light. So I mean, how do you listen to light, and how do you hear light? I mean, it is a different form of vibration and frequency and density, and it is. I know that I was hearing also there's the sound coming off the planets.
Right.
I mean, all the
Yes.
planets and that, and I to go into that would be quite detailed here, but that's the question is there is some other form of intelligence that's going on in terms of hertz and frequencies, and again, how do we listen to that? Because I think it's giving us some messages that, and of course, what we're finding also in England in the crop circle phenomena, there's resonance and there's sound and there's tone in the imagery. When you look at the mathematics, when you look at the sacred geometry, and of course the sacred geometry of the cathedrals, all of that, that has some sense of balance. There's something going on in terms of geometric harmonics. And I think that's where it can become quite healing, because there's a wholeness in sound and harmonics. But this seems to be coming now. It seems the information seems to be coming, with NASA, the return to the moon. There's a lot of stuff going on there. I don't understand it. I'm just kind of, the question is here, how can we use contemplative listening to watch this phenomena unfold? Because I think there might be message there that will be healing for the planet.
I think the notion is expanding our awareness as much as we can. And I think that's what Richard has done for us.
Yes.
Asking us to expand our awareness. And it may be that we shall, as human beings, develop a greater awareness. I'm personally, as a composer, using a device developed in Italy, but also in the US, where we can hear the sounds of the plants, where the vibrations of the plants are made audible within the frequency range. Now, some people are very suspicious of this, but for me, it builds a huge relationship with a plant, which becomes an improviser alongside we gather together once a fortnight now with a harp and a guitar and singing bowls and whichever plant we choose, or whichever plant is speaking that day. And the development of making the vibrations within the universe audible in some way, I think will develop quite quickly, providing the scientists don't say that this is rubbish, which is one of the things that's happening in that area. Yeah. I'm aware that we're at the end of our sort of time together, unless there are any questions. Oh, Ken wants to come in. Ken, would you like to come in and ask Richard a question?
Yes. I'm not. I don't know exactly the physics, quantum physics, but some knowledge tells me in the quantum physics, so our body or all things is comprised of the material and waves, and probably a sound carries waves. And so have you ever thought about quantum physics and so science or sound and spirituality? Because I'm so curious about another things. So some people who has been working in dyeing industry, that put a color on the textile. So that's that dyeing industry. So they say if you want to dye the clothes as clear white, so you put little bit tiny blue color ink on the dyeing machine. Not white. It's a little bit the blue ink is needed to express as a white. And if I apply the same thing in the silence, so if we notice, oh, this is a silence, is not complete science. It's a little bit noisy. Technical sense, it's noisy, but almost all, nobody can feel the sound, almost all nothing. But if we a little bit tiny noises, so that's the silence. So I think it's a really ridiculous question based on my curiosity. Please think about your feeling or your comment about my curiosity.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not going to venture into quantum physics much. I think the little I do know of quantum physics is showing me how little I don't know and how open-minded I need to be to our perception of space and connection between objects that we would see as incredibly distant. I think it undoes all of our preconceptions, and I think that's what I've taken from it. The little I've explored it, but it was interesting what you were saying about silence and actually how a little bit of blue dye added to the mix in order to create the silence, the white in a sense. And yeah, it's interesting one that silence is a very relative term. Obviously, it depends on what's gone before as to what you consider to be silent. It depends on the nature of the sound as to to whether you would perceive that as silence. The fact that there is no silence, even, I mean, I've been in a flotation tank and I've yet to go in an anechoic chamber where all sound is sort of taken away from the environment. You're left with the sounds of your own body. But we live with sound from the womb until we die, and that's and maybe beyond. But there is that sense of silence being a relative thing. It's interesting that we have that it's always in silence is always in relation to something. It's never an absolute. So I think that was an interesting comment. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to come in on that.
Well, I was just going to say that, that when I do an exercise when I was teaching young people, we did an exercise of 40 minutes sitting, noting all the sounds around us, the sort of work that you're doing. And then they went home to look for silence, and they cover themselves in their duvets and things like this. And then, of course, they heard all the sounds in their bodies. And the reason that we're so afraid of silence is because for a human being, silence is death. And I thought it was interesting, that wonderful poem where death is the joiner of the world, because the reason that our society is desperate about silence is because it's associated with dying, and dying is something that we can't that our society is trying to dismiss all the time. So if we were coming to terms with dying and death better, we would be less afraid of silence. And the anechoic chamber, of course, when people have been in it, often drives people mad, in a sense. So because of that silence. And just one little anecdote before I pass over to Liz. My mother, I remember, I'm quite old now, she always put a little bag of blue at the end of the washing to make the white whiter. So it was a standard part of the washing procedure in the 1940s that you always had your little bag of blue, not to make the stuff blue, but to make it white. So thank you, Ken, for reminding me of my mother with her little blue bags that she put into the end of the wash. Liz, it's over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Richard, thanks very much. And Ken, I thought that was a wonderful question. And I suppose my question doesn't really have an answer. It's more kind of a wondering question. And I think in a week when Elon Musk says he's 6 months away from the brain implant, and I'm thinking about how DNA that we leave behind us, you know, is incorporated into the trees and into the space. So I'm kind of wondering about this sound space question that just I have of my own. Can I hear the sound of the past? So in other words, do the sounds of a place, do some of those sounds linger in a place? That's a wondering question. I know there's no answer to it, but because I think when we're in a place, we bring all of our senses to detect something. And I'm not being kind of spooky, you know, but sometimes I feel I can hear the sounds in a place. And then when I look up the history of the place, yes, that is what happened. You know, if it's a sad place or if it's a place of, you know, places have and I just wonder, do the sounds of a place stay in the place at some kind of a quantum level? It's probably a question for Elon Musk. But anyway, it's just a wondering that I have about that. And
I know you want to come in, Sheila. Richard, can you attempt an answer at that before I bring Sheila in?
Yeah, there is. I honestly don't know whether at any kind of quantum level whether there is a residual kind of lingering of sound. I really related to what you said about using all the senses though, and that hearing is beyond just the mechanics of the ears and the brain, the auditory nerve. There's a listening, and they talk in counselling. It's talking of active listening, but of listening to the whole and using all of your senses. And in a sense, I would like to add that to the features of contemplative listening.
Yes.
It's more than just the sense of hearing. But I know what you mean. There is that kind of sense of work that when you walk into a space, sometimes that you have a sense of the sounds that have gone before. And, you know, it's quite liminal in the sense that it's very difficult sometimes to figure out quite what's going on and whether that's, you know, whether that's something that you're hearing or feeling or thinking. For me, it would be difficult to put my finger on it, and I'm not sure I would want to. I think there is a sense when I walk into some spaces of a connection with sound, where that comes from or how I'm sensing that, I'm not entirely sure. But as I said, sometimes I like that mystery. I like the not knowing, as we said in the
And I like when you played the sound of the snow. Like, I love walking in the snow, but it's more of I can feel the snow under my feet. So it was interesting. I've never listened to the sound. Like when I walk in the snow, I can hear it, but I can also feel it and feel the kind of muffled atmosphere. And that was just interesting, hearing it recorded in 2 dimensions instead of in the 3-dimensional experience. So thank you for that.
Yeah, we always think of synesthesia. No,
yeah,
we think of synesthesia as being some skill that some people have and some people don't. But I know the pathways from our senses are quite an early stage. I think a crossover and interlock. So that and I know there's some videos that I play. There's one of a pylon jumping up and down, and as it is completely silent, but as it hits the ground, you can hear the boom of it hitting the ground. And it's quite a strange sensation because you can kind of feel it in your ears, but you know there's no sound coming out. So I think even those people that I wouldn't necessarily class myself as synesthetic kind of listener, I think we all have those kind of interconnections. Well, I'm not going to speak as if I know, but certainly I was surprised at my own, that synesthesia happening.
Sheila, you want to come in?
Yeah, the prenate listens with its whole body. Through the vibrations, through its bones, through its flesh. And Thomas Verney in The Embodied Mind says that we have in our adult DNA tissue, we have the memory of our embryonic of the embryonic cells that tissue came from. And also I put in the chat, Craig Chalquist, Liz, talks about what your question is. He calls it terrapsychology. Craig Chalquist.
One of the things I would say is that I started several pieces in Winchester Cathedral called If These Walls Could Only Speak. And I had people all the way around the cathedral, 12 groups of people, some of them singing plain song, some of them, there was a scream at one point because there was when the cathedral was broken down with Cromwell and so on. And then there were sounds of worship songs, sounds of folk songs, and all of those things. And that was always a very, very impressive opening because the audience couldn't see anybody. They were all hidden. And it was as if the walls were singing. And I always said to my students when they sang in the cathedral, your sounds will be in those walls forever. And I do feel that the sounds are in the walls forever. And also the other thing is that in some of the, going back to some of the questions, in some of the sort of experiences of people from the past appearing, there is also the sound of weeping. In one house in which a couple moved in who'd had a cot death, and they were sad, and it seemed to wake up the fact that the ground was a plague pit. There was the sound of people crying in history as present as the sound of also the sound of the contemporary weeping as well. So some people do hear in the visionary experience of the past the sounds of the past as well. So I think it's an important point. I know, Annalisa, you want to come in, and we need to try and close down a little. But can you bring your question?
I'm just gonna. So this session was very, very interesting. But how do we relate this particular discourse to the arts? Because personally, I think this is a very useful and interesting meditative practice. But how do we bring this particular subject or practice within the universe of the arts? Is it because it involves the senses? Is it because it's a sensorial practice, or it's an open question?
Can I ask Richard if he regards himself as an artist? And I will say something about it too after Richard's given his comment.
Yeah, I would call myself a sound artist because that's what people relate to. I think the art is of the everyday, and I would like to see myself as myself, that's the wrong way of putting it, but I feel that my practice is something that needs to be a continual, as much as a continual artistry of life, rather than any particular art form or a section of my life in which I'm an artistic and I'm not. I don't think, I think we go through life, and I may have a focus on sound, but that I hope that sensitivity spills over and is part of everything that I do, rather than a specific job or role or identity as a sound artist. I think first and foremost, I'm very much drawn to a contemplative practice which expresses itself through art sometimes, but I would see the whole of the practice as art. I mean, it's interesting that as well that how do we make this the interesting thing. I work with people, they enjoy it as part of the practice. I've worked with visual artists who will integrate some of that into their own work. I think it's making it accessible and making it relevant to people's lives is quite difficult. It can seem quite abstract and quite a strange thing to do. But when people actually participate, that they often realize that this is something that they do all the time, or that they can do all the time. They can pay a peculiar attention to sounds that they wouldn't normally, and that brings hopefully an element of mindfulness and contemplative practice into their everyday lives. I think my feeling is that it needs to be a personal thing and something embedded to whatever degree people want to in their own lives. I think it's, and this is part of my feeling about it being embedded within a wider contemplative practice, is that it is something that you can share with others, and it's very accessible. There's no skill level that you need to be at in order to partake in and to participate. Everyone can do this, and everyone can be a part of it. I think that's openness, and that inclusivity is something that's unusual for some arts forms, where people go, oh, I'm not sure I can do that, or I need to train for so long to be able to do that, or I'm not an artist, I can't draw. All of those barriers that I think people have around art and art's work can be quickly undone, because the kind of activities that I'm doing, they might be seen as artistic, as sound art, but actually it's very natural, and it's very easy to engage with, I think. So I think, I don't know if that answers the question in the sense. I'm not sure it needs to be something that's pushed too hard. I think it just needs to find the right voice in the right place, and people connect with it and go, actually, yeah, I can work with that in some way, in my own way. And I think that's where it needs to be contextualized. It needs to be made a part of someone's life in a meaningful way, rather than and I think sound art does have the image of being rather inaccessible, rather niche, and I think that's a shame, because for me, I work with people in the the mall down the road, and introduce them, and you talk about sound and everyday sound to them. It's part of their life. It's not something that needs to be kept in galleries and networks online that are exclusive. I don't, it's not my experience, and I love working with people who have no interest in arts or sound art, because they're often the most open-minded and engage with it in ways that are unexpected. I love that, rather than overthinking things and keeping it as a closed little society, which I find very strange. Anyway, I've waffled a bit, but I hope that goes to some way to answering the question.
There is a whole developing area of sound art, and it is called acoustomology, and so on. So it is a developing world in the area of music. Natural sounds are being incorporated into with instrumental sounds, and as I think the notion of demystifying art is important. Dewey, in his writing on art, said that in a sense the movement of the dancer and so on is only there to show that there is dance in the action of the bow pulling and all of that in ordinary everyday life. So the function of life is to be able to see the beautiful in the everyday. And I often say as a musician that our task as a musician is to make audible the sounds that other people can't quite hear. And I think Richard has done that. And so, one of the rock musicians whose name I can't remember, it may even have been Bowie himself, saying that there are songs all out there. I have to grab it quickly because somebody might get it before I do. So all those sounds are there waiting to be caught. And some of them, as Richard has shown so beautifully today, are the sound of a radiator, and some of them are the sounds of an oboe, or the sound of yesterday, or my trouble seems so far away. And the notion of breaking down that division between art and the sound world, it was a false division in the first place. And of course, John Cage was the one who broke those down. And from John Cage, a lot of other people have carried on down that route of one way or another. So I think it's already in the art world, but the art world is inextricably bound up with the everyday. And also one of the pianists, the blind pianist in the Young Musician of the Year, said very early on that he could hear the music in the washing machine. So it's a question of allowing people to see that there is that is there all the time. And unfortunately, as you rightly suggest, Annalise, artists have been anxious to put themselves into a sort of little box so that other people can't get at it. But this is exactly what Dewey was saying in the 1930s, that we shouldn't be doing that. We should be able to see that in everything. And that hearing Mozart, it should enable us to be able to hear the music in the washing machine and the birds singing. Unfortunately, our society likes to limit everything down. And it is time, I think, to finish. But I want to thank Richard very, very warmly for opening up an area for us and seeing how limited our perceptions are and what we may gain from being open. I think I could, in there, Paul, who've written, "What are the sounds of the soul?" I just don't think we can end with anything much more large as a question that you've opened up for us, Richard, than what are the sounds of the soul? And on that question of unknowing, I think that's the time when we should end. Annalisa, have you got any other announcements that you need to make?
I believe so.
We should be putting another date in the equation soon, won't we?
Yes.
And Annalisa does so much of keeping us organized. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Richard, for opening up a world of huge questions in which we'll have to leave unknowing.
Super. Thank you very much, everyone. It was lovely to be with you. And thank you for some brilliant questions as well. So, and